I remember that afternoon with the kind of clarity usually reserved for grief or love, though it was neither that greeted me when I stepped into the Ashmolean, but something gentler, sadder, the sort of quiet only rain on old stone can teach a man to hear. The streets behind me carried the faint applause of tires hissing through puddles, and somewhere a bus exhaled as though exhausted by its own journey. Inside, the museum felt like a cathedral without its choir, only the muted echo of footsteps drifting through marble chambers. I suppose I found a measure of comfort in that stillness that matched the weather inside my head. I had not gone there for any particular purpose. There are days in Oxford when the walls themselves seem to lean towards you, asking for a little more than you can give. I'd felt that pressure since morning, a restlessness that refused to be bargained with, so I walked until the echoes dimmed and the wide atrium enfolded me in its patient hush. I wandered through the galleries with the kind of absent-minded reverence one offers to objects older and wiser than oneself, though my thoughts drifted as they too often do to small disappointments, lost chances, and the peculiar emptiness that can follow a brief, ill-advised hope. It was near closing time when I reached the cloakroom. The attendant on duty, an older man with the resigned politeness of someone who has returned too many umbrellas to people who never thanked him, glanced at me with a faint light of recognition. "You left this behind earlier, sir," he murmured, though I had left nothing of the sort. He held out a small torn sheet, no larger than a shopping receipt. The handwriting tilted in two different directions, as though the pen passed through unequal hands. Half a line of poetry clung to the top edge of a fragment from dawn, if memory serves, followed by a time, smudged by moisture, and beneath it a phrase that unsettled me in its unvarnished simplicity: "You left me no choice." I said nothing to the attendant, merely folded the slip into my coat pocket, and felt the slight tremor it left in my fingers. It was not the sort of message one expects from the lost property of a museum. It lingered in my mind as I walked out into the courtyard, the rain falling in fast, fine strokes. A woman hurried past beneath a navy umbrella, a pair of students argued about the correct translation of a Latin phrase, and somewhere in the city a siren rose, held and faded. The ordinary pulse of Oxford continued its indifferent rhythm, yet I felt the faintest fissure forming between the world I stepped into and the one I'd left behind moments earlier. Back in my room later that evening, the slip of paper lay on my desk beside an untouched glass of whiskey. I found myself rereading the words, searching for the intention behind them. There was something too raw in the handwriting, too hurried in its formation. A plea, perhaps, or a confession, or simply the sort of unfinished thought that leads nowhere except into trouble. I tried to dismiss it as someone else's sorrow misplaced, but it refused to quieten. The Oxford Mail lay folded beneath my lamp. A small article, tucked into the lower corner of the second page, mentioned the death of a young researcher found near St. John's. The phrasing felt clinical, but I knew those words "circumstances unclear" carried their own quiet foreboding. A suspected overdose, a promising career abbreviated, a life folded away like a note no one meant to read. It should have remained no more than a coincidence. Yet as the rain kept time against my window, I felt something stir, a needle beginning its slow swing towards trouble. Later I would understand how faint that first signal had been. But that night it was simply a whisper from the cloakroom of a museum, and a stranger's despair resting in the shape of a torn note. It was enough to keep me awake. I arrived at the station earlier than usual the next morning, though only because sleep had been unwilling to show itself with any sincerity. The city was still damp from the night's rain, and a faint mist clung to the gardens behind the building as though Oxford wished to withhold its truth for a little longer. Lewis noticed my mood instantly. Of course he did, though he had the tact to mention only that I looked as though I'd met the morning halfway and lost the argument. I told him about the note from the Ashmolean, watching his expression settle into that familiar crease of cautious curiosity. There's a kind of patience to Lewis I never quite mastered. He waits for the shape of things to reveal themselves, while I chase shadows as though they'd promised to lead me home. The report on the death came in shortly after. Thomas Elwood, aged 27, postgraduate in Renaissance literature, a mind as sharp as his academic record, was unstable. Found near the wall behind St. John's. A suspected overdose. That phrase again, carrying the same muted warning as an off-key note in a string quartet. We walked to the college beneath a sky the color of wet paper, the lingering smell of rain rising from the pavements. Oxford has a particular way of dressing its tragedies in academic calm, as if the stones themselves conspire to soften the ugliness of human frailty. Elwood's supervisor received us in an office lined with books that had probably not been touched since the term before last. He spoke with the polished regret of a man who has already drafted his condolences in 3 different registers. Elwood was brilliant, yes. Troubled, certainly. Distracted. The last word hung in the air like a curtain that resisted being drawn aside. When pressed, he admitted there had been a woman, though he offered no name. His tone carried something else too, a faint irritation that scholarship might be compromised by sentiment. I asked whether Elwood had been himself in recent weeks. The supervisor gave a small, brittle smile that told me he had been no one's idea of himself for quite some time. Back outside, Lewis remarked that the fellow had quoted Donne incorrectly during the conversation, a line about parting that had its rhythm wrong by half a beat. I pretended not to notice my own surprise. Lewis rarely spots literary nuances before I do. It was the second misquotation in 2 days, and both circling the same themes of severance and regret. Coincidence, perhaps, or the beginning of a pattern murmuring beneath the surface. Elwood's rucksack had been logged with his personal effects. In it, folded with a care that felt incongruous against the rest of his disorderly belongings, was a cloakroom ticket from the Ashmolean. Same day, same hour as the note I'd been handed. Lewis asked whether it meant anything. I told him it might, though the truth was I felt the first real pull of the case at that moment, a faint alignment of details like stars that had begun shifting into recognizable constellations. We visited Elwood's college room, a cramped space cluttered with sheets of half-formed essays, books stacked in teetering columns, and a faint scent of old coffee clinging to the air. On the desk lay a dogged copy of Donne's poems, its pages worn thin at the edges. A bookmark rested between 2 stanzas concerning unreciprocated devotion, a detail I wished I could dismiss as sentimentality, though I suspected Elwood had lived too much of his life leaning towards people who leaned away. Lewis pointed out a timetable pinned above the desk, with certain hours circled more than once. Evening visits, perhaps. Meetings with someone he didn't wish recorded in more formal schedules. I felt that small quickening again, the kind that precedes understanding without yet reaching it. There were too many private rituals in this room, too many secrets pressed between its unremarkable objects. That usually means trouble. As we left, the corridor's floorboards creaked beneath our steps, as though the college itself was shifting its weight uneasily. Elwood had been hiding something, of that I was certain. And somewhere in the folds of his last days, in the ink of misquoted poetry and the strange gravity of a torn note, the truth was beginning to lift its head, faint and unresolved, as dawn through a winter fog. There is a particular quietness in Oxford's residential streets mid-afternoon, when the students are tucked away in libraries and the tourists have retreated toward their tea rooms. It was during that lull that Lewis and I made our way to the Somerville-owned townhouse where Elwood had lived with 2 other graduate students. The pavement still carried the gloss left by the morning's drizzle, and the chestnut trees standing watch along the road held their leaves as though reluctant to let them fall. I remember thinking that such calm facades rarely conceal calm lives. Usually, the more beautifully a street presents itself, the deeper the fractures beneath the doors. A young woman opened the door to us, Celine Markham. a doctoral candidate with the kind of poise that made her appear older than she must have been. She led us into a narrow sitting room cluttered with books and wine glasses that looked as if they had been placed down a week ago and never moved again. She spoke of Elwood with a mixture of irritation and weariness, describing him as clingy in a way that suggested she was trying to play down some older tenderness. Her eyes flicked toward a photograph on a nearby shelf before she caught herself. A small gesture, quick and guilty. You learn to watch for those. The photograph showed the three housemates at a college event, Elwood leaning slightly toward her, a posture far more revealing than any confession. Lewis noticed it too. I saw his eyebrows shift just enough to betray the observation. Celine insisted she had been working in the college library the night Elwood died. She listed the time with an almost rehearsed clarity, as though she had prepared for this conversation before we'd even stepped inside. It was the precision that unsettled me. People rarely recall ordinary evenings with such neat, polished detail. She asked if we believed the rumors about his drug use. I told her we were exploring all possibilities. Her mouth tightened, and for the first time I saw the faintest tremor in her composure, as though the veneer of academic detachment might crack if pressed any harder. The second occupant of the house, Dr. Adrian Vollard, received us in what he called his study, though it looked more like a room someone had long since abandoned hope of ordering. Books leaned against each other in broken formations, and half-drained bottles rested on the desk like stranded travelers. Vollard himself had the elegant ruin of a man who had once been respected and had grown used to disappointing others. He admitted to an argument with Elwood a week earlier, though he framed it as an intellectual disagreement about poetic form. His phrasing hovered around certain words, repeating devotion, insistence, and inevitable with a frequency that felt less accidental than defensive. When I asked whether Elwood had borrowed money from him, Vollard smiled with an odd melancholy and replied that the boy had borrowed too much from too many people. It was the way he blinked a little too slowly afterward that warned me he was hiding something, though whether it was guilt or simply a wounded pride remained unclear. The third housemate, Peter Holt, greeted us with the geniality of a man who had learned to mask discomfort behind agreeable chatter. He insisted that Elwood had been fine the last time he saw him. Fine. That word again is the blandest refuge for a lie. Yet Holt's version of events was smoother than either of the others, so smooth, in fact, that it took me a moment to realize what bothered me. He was giving us answers before we had asked the questions. When Lewis inquired about Elwood's recent relationships, Holt's smile shifted just a fraction too quickly, landing somewhere between amusement and anxiety. Someone said he took things too seriously, he murmured, though he offered no name attached to the accusation. As we stepped back into the corridor, the floor groaned beneath our weight, a faint echo that traveled through the house like a reluctant confession. Three intelligent people, each with motives wrapped in different shades of truth, each offering stories polished enough to conceal their fractures. Celine's guilt, Vollard's bitterness, Holt's overeager calm, none of them rang cleanly. And somewhere in their overlapping accounts was a line of discord, a faint misalignment that had begun to press itself against my thoughts. Not enough to name. Not yet. But enough to remind me that people rarely lie neatly, even when they think they do. Outside, the last of the day's light slipped behind the college walls, leaving the street in a muted wash of grays. It occurred to me then, as Lewis locked his notebook away, that the truth about Elwood's final hours was beginning to take shape. I did not yet understand a quiet, uneasy outline sketched by people who feared that understanding more than they feared the law itself. The following morning arrived with the kind of colorless light that seems to flatten every street in Oxford into something half-remembered. I walked into Elwood's room again, this time alone, wanting a second look without the distractions that accompany company, even good company like Lewis. There is something to be said for the privacy of another man's silence, for the chance to hear what no one else is patient enough to listen for. His room felt different in the early hour, as though it had settled overnight into a stillness that invited confession. On the desk, beneath the scattered notes and abandoned drafts, lay a diary I had overlooked the day before. Its cover was worn at the edges, softened by handling, the kind of object kept close not for sentiment, but necessity. When I opened it, the faint impression of missing weight alerted me before my eyes did. The middle page had been ripped out, torn rather than cut, the fibers frayed and uneven. I held the diary up to the window, and a thin winter light slid across the remaining pages, revealing the faint imprint of lines once pressed against the missing leaf. Nothing legible, only a suggestion of anger in the depth of the indentation. I sat at his desk and let my eyes wander over the chaos Elwood had left behind. Books leaned like weary soldiers, notebooks lay open to thoughts of abandoned mid-sentence, and atop them rested a half-finished crossword. The puzzle caught my attention, not for its difficulty, but for a single clue circled in dark, impatient strokes, forsaken promise, 5 letters. The answer flickered at the edge of my mind. Oath, perhaps, though there was something too expected about that. Or tryst, though that felt too romantic for Elwood's current tragedies. It bothered me in a way I couldn't quite name, the way an itch beneath a bandage bothers long before the wound is ready to be seen. I folded the crossword carefully, tucking it into my coat. Whatever else Elwood had left behind, this piece felt deliberate. Lewis arrived as I was studying a slim volume on the desk of a Renaissance poetry anthology, its spine cracked with use. Inside the cover, an inscription had been written in small, slanted handwriting, "For A." I still remember the gatehouse. The capital A had been pressed harder than the other letters, leaving a faint impression even on the back of the cover. Lewis remarked that Elwood must have been sentimental. I told him sentimentality often masks something far more stubborn. He gave me that look, half amusement, half worry, as though he suspected I was already turning the case into something heavier than it needed to be. With the diary, the crossword, and the book in hand, we left the college. On our way back, the air carried the smell of damp paper drifting from the Bodleian, mingling with the first hint of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. The city was settling into its winter posture. Lewis mentioned that the missing page troubled him. People don't tear out diary pages unless they're afraid of what they've written. I agreed, though I found myself thinking it was not fear that had driven Elwood, but determination. The tear was too jagged, too hurried, the gesture of someone who acted quickly before his courage faltered. We returned to the Ashmolean in the late afternoon, the sky bruised with clouds that refused to decide whether to break. I stood in the cloakroom again, looking at the row of hooks and umbrellas, as though the note I'd been handed might whisper something new if only I stood in the right place. The attendant from before recognized me but said nothing. I asked whether anyone had returned looking for the slip of paper. He shook his head slowly, almost sorrowfully. No one had. As we left the museum, Lewis asked what I thought the message on the torn page could have held. I told him the truth as I felt it then. Whatever Elwood wrote had frightened someone, maybe himself, maybe someone else, and frightened people rarely act with precision. They rip, they hide, they misdirect. And somewhere among those torn fibers and unfinished words, the shape of his final days was beginning to emerge, faint as breath on cold glass. It was Lewis who first suggested we speak with the young woman mentioned in Elwood's correspondence, though he phrased it with the kind of careful neutrality that tells you he'd already formed an opinion. We found her in one of the quieter conservation rooms at the Ashmolean, a place lit by soft, disciplined light that made every object seem older than it truly was. She stood at a long table, examining a fragment of pottery with the patience of someone who understood how easily the past could crumble in one's hands. When she looked up, I recognized immediately the mixture of self-possession and strain that accompanies anyone trying to appear less wounded than they are. Alice Redding introduced herself in a voice so calm it seemed practiced. She admitted she had known Elwood, though only after a brief hesitation that told me the truth lay somewhere deeper beneath the first version she offered. She spoke of him in measured tones, bright, impulsive, drawn to intensity. Someone who lived too quickly for his own good. I noticed the slightest tightening at the corners of her mouth whenever she used the past tense, as if each word carried a small private sting. Lewis asked how recently she had seen Elwood. "A fortnight," she said. Then, after a moment, more softly perhaps, a little less. Her hands moved constantly as she spoke, adjusting tools on the table, shifting the pottery shard, aligning a brush with unnecessary precision. It was a restlessness that belonged not to habit, but to guilt. When I asked whether she had ever visited the gatehouse near Somerville, she looked up sharply. The expression was gone almost before it reached her eyes, but the damage was done. I told her we had found an inscription in Elwood's book, Foray. I still remember the gatehouse, and she lowered her gaze with the kind of controlled breath that precedes either honesty or a well-crafted lie. She chose the latter. She said she had no memory of such a place. The lie was too quick, too complete. I asked whether she knew anything about the torn note left in the cloakroom. She shook her head, though her voice broke slightly around the edges, like a thread pulled too tightly. "Some choices hurt everyone," she murmured, as if speaking to herself. The phrasing echoed the tone of the note almost exactly. Lewis looked at me, a question forming in his silence. I let it sit. Answers that arrive too early rarely hold their shape. Alice attempted to steer the conversation toward Elwood's academic struggles, insisting he had been under immense pressure. She mentioned a supervisor's criticism, a failed funding application, nights spent revising papers until exhaustion blurred the words. Yet beneath her explanations lingered a fear that had nothing to do with academic failure. It was the fear of someone who believes, however wrongly, that they played a part in another person's collapse. She asked finally whether we believed Elwood had intended to harm himself. I told her we were examining every possibility, though I suspected she already carried her own belief like a stone behind her ribs. Her eyes lifted to mine briefly, bright with the quiet ache of someone holding too many truths. In that moment, I saw something that troubled me more than any answer. She could have spoken the unmistakable posture of a person who had tried to end something gently and discovered too late that endings rarely behave. As we left the conservation room, the soft hum of the air vents followed us into the corridor, blending with the faint smell of varnish and dust. Lewis remarked that she seemed fragile. I told him fragility can be a kind of armor, the last barrier between a person and the thing they cannot bear to admit. He asked what I thought she was hiding. I said only that her lie about the gatehouse had been too clean, too swift, and that swift lies often point towards slow, painful truths. Outside, the museum's facade caught the late afternoon light, casting long, thin shadows across the steps. I found myself thinking of the torn note again, of handwriting tilted in two directions, of unfinished sentences and abandoned promises. Somewhere between Alice's trembling composure and Elwood's final days lay a truth neither of them had been ready to face. And now, inevitably, it was beginning to find me instead. The days that followed settled into the kind of dreary drizzle Oxford performs better than any city I know. A persistent, whispering rain that softened the edges of everything, pavements, tempers, truth. Lewis and I found ourselves walking toward the rented townhouse again, summoned not by evidence but by a lingering unease I could not quite articulate. Vollard had remained too calm during our first visit, too polished in his evasions, and there is something about a composed man in a disordered room that always strikes me as wrong. He greeted us with the same languid civility, though I noticed the faint sourness of old wine hanging in the air more strongly this time. A bottle sat on the desk beside a sheaf of student essays, its label half peeled away, its contents reduced to a shallow, muddy pool. When I remarked on the vintage, he gave a tired laugh and said it had been a gift from a colleague. Even as he spoke, he slid his hand over the receipts scattered nearby, collecting them too quickly, arranging them into a neat stack that hadn't existed moments earlier. It was a gesture so automatic, so revealing in its haste, that I felt the first clear flare of suspicion. Lewis caught my eye. Later, outside, he would tell me he noticed the dates on the receipts didn't match the bottle on the desk minutiae he usually leaves to me. Inside the room, though, he simply shifted his weight and asked how well Vollard had known Elwood. The answer, as expected, was another collection of half-truths professionally. Yes, personally, not very intellectually, perhaps too closely. It was the last admission, delivered with a slight downturn of the mouth, that suggested something sharper had passed between them, envy, maybe, or resentment disguised as mentorship. I asked whether he had lent Elwood money. The question startled him more than it should have. He insisted he had done no such thing, though his gaze drifted, betraying the flicker of a thought he hadn't prepared to hide. He spoke then of Elwood's charm, his recklessness, his tendency to overstep. "People like him burn fast," he murmured, swirling what remained of the wine. "They exhaust you long before they realize they're exhausting themselves." It was a sentiment delivered with such weary accuracy that, for a moment, I almost believed him. Yet as he talked, I found my attention drawn not to his words, but to the stains on the stack of receipts, faint blotches of deep red, almost brown now with age. Not from the wine on his desk, I thought. A different vintage, a more expensive one. I reached for the papers under the pretext of reading an annotation. He let me take them too easily. People who have nothing to hide guard their belongings more carelessly. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into a fine mist that clung to our coats like ash. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him Vollard was lying, though not about the things he believed himself lying about. The forged receipts were obvious enough, but they felt decorative. A surface lie, a convenient distraction. It was the ease with which he had spoken of Elwood's self-destruction that troubled me more. His tone had not been the irritation of a man inconvenienced. It had been the resignation of someone who had been expecting disaster and was relieved in some quiet, shameful way to see it arrive. Lewis suggested we bring him in for further questioning. I shook my head. A good red herring rewards patience. A bad one wastes your time. I hadn't yet decided which kind we were dealing with, but something about the wine stains their uniformity, their placement gnawed at me. Staged, I thought. Too neat. Too deliberate. Real guilt rarely organizes itself so tidily. We walked back toward the station, the smell of wet leaves rising from the ground, the lamplight smudged into soft halos by the mist. I found myself thinking again of Elwood's half-finished crossword, of the clue that refused to resolve itself neatly in my mind. Forsaken promise. 5 letters. I whispered the possibilities to myself, trying them on like borrowed coats. None fit just yet. Somewhere between Vollard's counterfeit confidence and the ruined wine on his desk, an answer hovered, the wrong answer, I suspected, but one constructed carefully enough to tempt belief. And as any detective learns painfully over the years, the lies we are meant to find are rarely the ones that matter most. I've often found that certain places acquire a kind of private weather, shaped less by the elements than by the memories that cling to them. The old gatehouse near Somerville was such a place, a squat, solitary structure of stone and ivy, long abandoned by its intended purpose, yet still holding an air of faint expectancy, as if waiting for footsteps that would never return. Lewis and I approached it just after dusk, when the last of the light was draining from the sky and the college lamps began to glow like small, patient eyes watching over the garden paths. The air inside the gatehouse carried the cold stillness of a room that has known too many secrets and too few confessions. Dust lay thick on the window ledge, disturbed only in a thin arc where someone's sleeve or hand must have brushed against it recently. The smell was a mixture of damp stone and stale air, but underneath it lingered something sharper, a whisper of old wine, faint but unmistakable. Lewis noticed it too. He frowned, murmuring that the scent reminded him of Vollard's study. But the fragrance was different, cleaner, almost elegant, the kind of bottle someone saves for a moment they believe matters. A wooden chair stood against the far wall, its legs uneven on the flagstones. On the seat rested a loose sheet of paper, folded once. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest as I picked it up, the fragile anticipation that accompanies fragments of truth. It was another piece of the handwritten note from the Ashmolean. Same ink, same hurried slant, though this fragment had softened at the edges as though handled too many times. "Forgive me," it read. The words trembled with a kind of helpless sincerity. I showed it to Lewis, who asked whether Elwood had written it. I told him the handwriting suggested otherwise. The loops were too rounded, the pressure too gentle. Someone with a quieter nature, perhaps, or someone forcing calm into a moment that didn't deserve it. Near the chair, the floor bore the faint imprint of a shoe that had disturbed the dust before settling into stillness again. I crouched, tracing its outline. Not a man's heavy step, I thought. Something lighter. Lewis asked whether I believed Alice might have come here. The inscription in Elwood's book had said gatehouse, with the intimacy of someone recalling an old meeting place, and the earlier flicker in Alice's expression had confirmed more than she'd intended. I said nothing, though the truth hovered between us like breath in cold air. We searched the remaining corners of the room, our footsteps stirring echoes that felt too loud in the cramped space. In one corner, beneath a loose stone, I found a second item. An empty wine cork, the branding worn smooth, but enough remained to reveal it had belonged to a vintage far beyond a student's means. Lewis gave a low whistle and said someone had money to spare. I shook my head. Not money. Intent. People do not bring expensive wine to forgotten places unless they are rehearsing a ritual or an ending. Outside, the garden behind Somerville lay quiet, the branches of the bare trees scratching softly against the darkening sky. I leaned against the low wall, letting the evening air settle the unease in my thoughts. The fragments of the note, the one from the cloakroom and the one from the chair, no longer felt like random pieces of despair. They were parts of a dialogue, written perhaps at different times, by different hands, converging toward a moment neither party had fully understood. Lewis asked what I made of it all. I told him only what I could stomach admitting aloud, that the gatehouse had been significant to Elwood and someone else. That something tender had once passed between them here. And that whatever had occurred in this unlit room recently had carried not the sharpness of violence, but the sorrow of inevitability. As we walked away, the gatehouse seemed to shrink back into the shadows, its windows dimming to the dull shine of old glass. I felt the growing certainty that this case was not about malice in its purest form, but about the quiet catastrophes people create when they mistake love for rescue. And somewhere among those torn pages and timid apologies lay the truth of Elwood's final days, waiting as Oxford so often waits for someone stubborn enough to listen. The next morning unfolded with a heaviness that seemed stitched into the very air, as though Oxford itself sensed some older wound being pressed open. I walked toward the Bodleian with the damp chill settling beneath my coat, each step carrying the reluctant knowledge that whatever truth Elwood had chased, he had not been the first to bleed for it. The gatehouse had told me enough to know we were dealing with something older than any late-night quarrel or failed romance. Something that had festered long before Elwood ever touched pen to paper. Lewis met me outside the old school's quadrangle, rubbing his hands together briskly, remarking that the place always felt colder than the rest of the city. He wasn't wrong. The Bodleian has its own climate, the smell of dust and ink, the faint echo of scholars who never learn to let go of their obsessions. Inside, the warmth was little more than a rumor. We signed in, our footsteps muffled beneath the high ceilings, and made our way to the Special Collections reading room where Elwood had spent the last months of his studies. The librarian on duty was a thin, austere man, with the air of someone who had long ago surrendered most earthly pleasures in exchange for unhindered access to ancient manuscripts. When we mentioned Elwood's name, he offered a curt nod, as though recalling the boy's restlessness with a private mixture of fondness and irritation. He guided us toward a table where Elwood often worked, noting that the young man had been researching a minor plagiarism scandal from the late 1980s. Not exactly glamorous, he said, unless one had a taste for academic skeletons. I felt a faint stirring, then that prickle of intuition that arrives before the facts agree to arrange themselves. A plagiarism case, quietly buried, often hides more than stolen words. Sometimes it hides the sort of compromise that reshapes lives without ever appearing in official records. Lewis leaned closer and whispered that perhaps Elwood had uncovered something better left forgotten. He meant it as speculation, but the thought echoed uncomfortably in my own mind. We discovered the rest of Elwood's notebook lodged between two volumes on Renaissance rhetoric. It had the weary look of something handled too frequently and too anxiously. Inside, his handwriting spilled. Across the pages in uneven strokes, dense notes, frantic arrows, circled names, and repeated questions. In the middle, almost like an accusation bruising through the paper, he had written one phrase 3 times, and she didn't deserve it. The pronoun unsettled me. It was too bare, too stripped of context, as if the writer feared naming the person might summon something he was not prepared to face. Lewis pointed to a name in the margins, a visiting scholar from years ago, dismissed under quiet circumstances. Another name followed, the supervisor who had taken over the department shortly thereafter. The sequence formed a pattern, and somewhere within that pattern, the shape of Alice's fear began to emerge. I remembered her steady hands, trembling slightly when the gatehouse was mentioned. I remembered the cork hidden beneath the stone, the wine, the forced composure. Still, the truth remained elusive, like a figure glimpsed through frosted glass. We took the notebook back to the station, where the fluorescent lighting flattened every page into sterile clarity. I read through Elwood's final entries carefully, searching for the moment where his research had crossed the line from academic interest into personal desperation. It came in the form of a single, cramped paragraph wedged between larger notes, a confession written not by him, but transcribed from a source he did not name. Words about a falsified accusation, a ruined application, a career halted before it had begun. Someone had paid the price for another's ambition, and Elwood, in his earnest, misguided way, had believed he could right the old wrong. Lewis asked who he had been trying to save. I gave no answer, though Alice's face flickered through my thoughts like a shadow behind frosted glass. By late afternoon, the rain had returned, a thin, whispering drizzle that blurred the outlines of the colleges. I walked alone along Holywell Street, letting the cold sink into me the way uncomfortable truths often do. The city felt heavy with memory, as though every stone held a fragment of someone's guilt. I thought of the torn diary page, the missed clue in the crossword, the scent of wine in the gatehouse. Each hint, fragile and incomplete, belonged to a narrative stretching backward, long before Elwood's name appeared in any notebook. A past that refuses to stay dead tends to claw its way upward through the smallest cracks. And now, with each new detail surfacing like bone through disturbed earth, I could feel the shape of something rising, something neither Elwood nor Alice had been able to control. Whatever came next, it would not be gentle. There comes a particular moment in an investigation when the pieces seem, at last, to drift together into something resembling coherence. It is a deceptive feeling of the mind's eagerness to settle, to declare itself satisfied. And I have learned over the years that such moments are often treacherous. Still, when Lewis and I left the station that evening, stepping into the thin amber light pooling across the pavement, I felt the faint tug of completion pulling at my thoughts. The lecturer, Vollard, had cracked sooner than I expected. Perhaps guilt wore down his defenses, perhaps he found relief in the idea of confessing to a version of events that still allowed him to play the tragic fool. In any case, he telephoned the station just after dusk, asking to speak with us before his courage dissolved. He met us in his sitting room, the curtains drawn, the room thick with a scent of wine that had long ago ceased to be celebratory. He told us about the confrontation with Elwood arriving unannounced, hurling accusations about academic theft, waving a stack of half-examined documents he claimed were evidence. Vollard insisted he'd tried to reason with him, that tempers had risen, that Elwood's instability had become impossible to manage. He spoke as though narrating a confession he had rehearsed privately, smoothing the rough edges of truth with a trembling hand. He admitted, too quickly to be entirely sincere, that he had pushed Elwood away, not violently, he claimed, but firmly enough that the younger man had stumbled. Then, with a kind of mournful resignation, he suggested that Elwood must have left in despair, already half determined to end his life. It was a story crafted from plausible shadows, the kind that tempts the weary mind to nod and move on. Lewis looked at me with quiet expectation as we walked back into the night. He wanted to believe it. Perhaps part of me did too. A case neatly folded, motive linked to pride, tragedy explained by human weakness, a tidy narrative, the kind archives digest with minimal discomfort. We stopped beneath a street lamp, its glow settling over us like a tired blessing. Lewis asked whether it was enough, whether we should close the case. I remember that I almost said yes. But the mind has its own small rebellions. Back in my room, long past midnight, I emptied my coat pockets onto the desk, the two fragments of the torn note, the crossword Elwood had abandoned, and the faded cork from the gatehouse. They lay there like pieces of a puzzle that refused to align with the story Vollard had spun. I stared at the note first. I had read it so often that the words had begun to lose meaning, becoming shapes instead of sentences. Yet now, in the pool of lamplight, I noticed something I had missed before. The subtle shift in the handwriting midway down the page, a change in the pressure of the pen, the slant of the letters. 2 hands, 2 voices, a dialogue masquerading as a confession. I felt a chill crawl upward through my spine. If Elwood had written only part of the note, then the final line "you left me no choice" belonged to someone else, someone who wished to shape the narrative of his death. I lifted the crossword next, tracing the circle Elwood had drawn around the clue. Forsaken promise. 5 letters. Oath no longer felt adequate. Lewis had suggested tryst earlier, but that too seemed insufficient. My mind drifted through the possibilities until one word anchored itself with troubling clarity. Betray. 6 letters, not 5. I muttered a quiet curse under my breath. The answer refused to fit, and yet it felt truer than anything Vollard had said. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with the kind of heaviness that warns you a lie has just been accepted as fact by everyone but you. I returned to the fragments of the note, studying the edges. They did not align cleanly. Someone had torn them with hesitation, not haste. Hesitation implies care or attachment. Outside, the wind edged against the window pane like a restless thought. I leaned back in my chair, understanding with a kind of weary certainty that Vollard's confession had been nothing more than a false ending, a story designed to draw a curtain over a deeper truth. It had been crafted skillfully enough to deceive most men, perhaps even the better part of myself. But the handwriting, that slightest change in direction, had betrayed him, or rather, had betrayed someone else entirely. The case was far from over. I remember walking back to the Ashmolean the following afternoon with the peculiar heaviness that settles in the chest when one finally admits a truth that has been circling for days. The false ending had shaken something loose inside me, a quiet, unwelcome recognition that the story I'd allowed myself to believe was too simple, too clean. Oxford was never simple, people even less so. And Elwood, for all his impulsive idealism, had not been the sort of man to accept despair without a fight. Someone had helped shape the manner of his leaving, and now the fragments of the note pressed against my pocket like small persistent accusations. The museum felt different that day. There was a stillness beneath its usual hum, as though the building sensed the weight of what I carried through its doors. Alice was in the restoration room again, bent over a manuscript under the bright, disciplined lamp. She looked up only when my shadow crossed the table. I saw something flicker through her expressions, not fear, but the sudden exhaustion of someone who has run out of places to hide her truths. I placed the fragments of the handwritten note before her, arranging them like brittle relics. She stared at them for a long time before whispering that she hadn't meant for it to look that way. I said nothing, allowing her silence to grow into something that demanded more from her than any question I could have asked. She touched the edge of the paper with the gentlest movement, and I saw her mask slip, a small tremor settling along her jawline. She spoke then, haltingly, about Elwood's insistence on revisiting the past, on unearthing the old scandal that had nearly lost her the conservation post years before she'd even earned it. She confessed that he had found documents, real ones, damning ones, proving that the accusation had been constructed by someone else in her cohort, a student desperate to eliminate competition. When I asked whether she knew the identity of that student, she nodded once. The name she gave was one already threaded through the case in a quieter, subtler way. Holt. I felt the familiar tightening of the mind when pieces begin, at last, to recognize one another. Holt, the amiable mask, the polished lies offered too quickly, the ease with which he had spoken of Elwood's supposed despair. He had been circling the story from the beginning, positioning himself as witness, yet never fully revealing his proximity. And now, with Alice's whispered admission, his role shifted not into the center, perhaps, but into a place where guilt might plausibly take root. Still, I could sense Alice was holding something back. Her breathing had grown shallow, her eyes fixed not on me but on the slanted, uneven handwriting of the note, the half that belonged to Elwood and the half that bore her own quiet hand. I asked her directly whether she had added the final line. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. She said she had written it in anger or fear or some confused blend of both, minutes before they parted at the gatehouse that last evening. You left me no choice. She had meant it as an ultimatum of sorts, a plea for him to stop digging, to stop dragging the past into a future she could finally see forming. She had not known it would become an epitaph. I asked whether she believed Elwood had intended to harm himself. She shook her head so quickly, so fiercely, that it startled me. He was trying to save me, she said. He thought the truth could mend things. He thought everything broken had a price and that he was willing to pay it. There was grief in her voice. Yes, but also something far deeper, a regret sharpened by the knowledge that someone else had intervened after she walked away. Lewis waited for me outside the gallery, pacing in slow, thoughtful strides. I told him what Alice had revealed. He frowned, murmuring that the cloakroom timestamp still troubled him. If Elwood had left the museum after their meeting, the timing of his death didn't align with the official report. Someone had moved the body, Someone who wanted the conclusion to look clean, inevitable, tragic. Someone who believed a quiet death could protect the person he cared for. A sedative left in tea, perhaps, or a pill offered gently, wrapped in the guise of comfort. As we left the museum, a faint drizzle began stitching itself across the pavement, each drop carrying the hush of something half-spoken. I thought then of Holt's too ready answers, his rehearsed ease, his quiet affection for Alice that lingered in every sentence he'd uttered. Love is a dangerous motive, perhaps the most dangerous. It leads men to acts they would never recognize as cruelty until it is far too late. The truth, once it begins to turn, refuses to stop. And now it was, turning toward Holt with a clarity I could no longer ignore. The real choice, the one written on the torn note, the one that guided Elwood's final hours, had never belonged to Elwood at all. It belonged to someone who believed he was rescuing her. The final conversation unfolded in one of those narrow, lamplit corridors behind the college kitchens, where the tiles still held the day's warmth and the air smelled faintly of damp coats and overboiled tea. Holt had agreed to meet us there. Though the word agreed feels too generous, he walked toward us with the defeated gait of a man who has already been found out by his own conscience. Lewis stood beside me in patient stillness, but I felt a slow, familiar tightening in my chest, the awareness that whatever happened next would not bring comfort to anyone involved. Holt tried, at first, to maintain the light chatter that had shielded him through every earlier conversation, but his voice thinned at the edges, fraying like an old shirt collar. I asked him about the night Elwood died. Not the version he had given us. The real one. His eyes flickered, then not away, but inward, toward something he had been rehearsing in silence. He swallowed, twice, and spoke in a tone stripped of its artificial ease. He said Elwood had come home that evening, shaken, restless, talking about the past as though it could finally be undone. He spoke of Alice with a kind of reverence, Holt murmured, as though she'd been wronged in ways he could now correct. Holt admitted he had listened with the attentiveness of someone who knows he cannot compete with the man speaking but cannot help wanting to. Elwood had believed he could fix everything, the scandal, the shame, the years Alice lost chasing shadows that belonged to someone else. He had believed truth itself was a kind of salvation. When Holt paused, the corridor hummed faintly, and I could hear the kitchen vent sighing somewhere behind the wall. I asked him softly whether he had offered Elwood something to calm him. The silence that followed was answer enough. He nodded once, a small, brittle movement, then said he hadn't meant to hurt him. He had only wanted to stop the spiraling, the wild conviction that by exposing the old lie he could save Alice's future. Holt said Elwood was shaking, barely coherent, and he had handed him a sedative he kept for his own anxiety. Just one, he claimed, just something to help him sleep. But Elwood, in his frantic state, had taken more. Or perhaps he had taken it too quickly. Or perhaps Holt had underestimated the potency. The truth, Holt whispered, was that he hadn't checked the dosage. He hadn't thought. He had only wanted a moment of quiet, a space where Elwood might stop tearing open wounds that had only barely begun to scar. When he realized what had happened, panic hollowed him out. He dragged the body through the back gate, past the shadowed wall of St. John's, and left him where despair would be the simplest explanation. He had believed it would protect Alice. He had believed Elwood, even in death, might still be trying to save her. I stood there listening, the corridor pressing in with a thick, oppressive stillness. Lewis shifted beside me, his jaw tightening. Holt's voice had grown so low that I had to lean in to hear the last of it. He said he had written nothing on the note. That part had been Alice's, but he had seen Elwood tuck it into his pocket before leaving the gatehouse days earlier. Holt had recognized the words when the police found the body. "You left me no choice." He said he had carried that line around in his mind like a sentence handed down long before he ever understood it. We escorted him outside into the evening. The quad lay soaked in pale light, the sky the color of extinguished smoke. Students crossed the lawns with the quiet urgency of people late for something trivial and temporary. Holt walked between us without resistance, the weight of the truth finally settling across his shoulders like a mantle he could no longer shrug away. Later, standing alone near the entrance to the Ashmolean, I felt the city breathing its slow, ancient breath. Rain had begun again, soft and steady, polishing the stones to a muted sheen. There was no satisfaction in the resolution, only the fragile hush that follows a truth uncovered too late to save anyone. Elwood's idealism, Alice's fear, Holt's desperate devotion, all three tangled into a sorrow no verdict could untangle. Some cases do not close so much as fade, leaving only a thin ache behind. And as I walked home beneath the rain, the torn note felt less like evidence and more like a mirror, a reminder of how easily love turns into ruin when no one knows how to hold it gently.